Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian from the Center for a New American Security, where we're meeting with one of America's leading Asia analysts, Patrick Cronin. Dr. Cronin, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Vago. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I want to take you, obviously, to the question of arbitration. The International Court decided on July the 12th that in invalidating a lot of China's sweeping claims to the South China Sea. Obviously, this has been a huge issue that everybody in the international community has been looking at. China's response has been to discredit the verdict and also, suggest that there's been a conspiracy, and also start to put pressure on some of its neighbors to negotiate deals on its terms. Talk to us more broadly about what the next steps have to be by the international community to sort of steer China into a more constructive direction on this, as opposed to what people fear is something that could become a trigger point for conflict.
Well, we have a landmark international legal ruling on maritime law. It has indeed discredited much of the excessive claim of China about the 9-dash line, for instance, but also about what were rocks versus what were potential islands. And they're all rocks. There are no islands in the South China Sea, it turns out, by this ruling, at least in the Spratlys.
If this weren't so serious, it would really be funny what people are really debating about here, but...
Well, it is indeed serious because it's about the rules of order in East Asia, where all of the neighbors of China are feeling the encroachment of a rising China, and they're counting on the United States to be the security backstop of the international rules. So building on this ruling means not letting China reject it outright and have that be the last word, but rather they can denounce it verbally, but they shouldn't do anything that is irrevocable with respect to changing facts on the ground or in the sea or in the air of the South China Sea in the coming months. That is, they shouldn't be allowed to establish an illicit, offensive air defense identification zone, or to start taking the Scarborough Shoal area that they effectively control right now, that's in Philippine exclusive economic zone, and starting to reclaim it and turn it into another outpost, a militarized outpost potentially like these other artificial islands they've built over the last 2.5 years. They shouldn't be allowed to push the Philippines off the Sierra Madre, off of its reef in the Yungan Shoal, off of Palawan Island, part of the Philippines, in the South China Sea as well. So those are the kinds of steps we're trying to prevent. That's at least don't do any more harm. Beyond that, we need to get together bilaterally with the Chinese to try to make sure that there are confidence-building measures that will ensure or at least minimize the risk of accidental escalation. And that means signaling. So when Admiral Richardson meets with his counterpart, publicly he may have to accept the sort of Chinese opera, the theatrics of being criticized and all the talking points. But privately he can say, Admiral Wu, don't mistake our determination to defend our ally. Don't do anything stupid.
Well, and Admiral Richardson, the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, was there to meet with Admiral Wu, who's his Chinese opposite number. And Marty Dempsey was in Beijing, sort of repeatedly sort of stressing that we will come to the aid of our allies, which was confusing to some in China, whose view was, well, we're the bigger power. I mean, obviously, the United States will back off. But by way of deterrence, what are some other moves that the region can use? I mean, there's a lot of discussion, for example, about triggering potentially an Article 5 clause, a mutual defense clause to sort of try to tamp things down and be a defensive mechanism. Walk us through about some of the diplomacy that can and should be happening right now in terms of shaping the region.
So if we're shaping the region over the next 5 or 10 years, and we don't want to see China position itself so that it displaces the U.S. and it basically bulldozes over the South China Sea and over its neighbors, we're talking about stopping to do any more damage. So it's a negative goal, it's a limited goal, but it's a realistic one as well. That's why an Article 5 guarantee, or something very close to it, having a former commander like Admiral Denny Blair, who's been out publicly talking about the need for an Article 5 agreement supporting the Philippines on Scarborough Shoal, that can be helpful as a deterrent to the Chinese not to dig any deeper in this hole. Hopefully that works, but in the meantime we're going to need to be still building regional diplomatic pressure on the Chinese in a positive way that has cooperation, that is the possibility of, for instance, joint exploration with the Philippines in parts of the South China Sea, but that has to be worked out in agreement with both parties or all parties. So we need both multilateral and bilateral pressure, but also with elements of cooperation. Cooperation with the Chinese about avoiding risk, but also about fisheries, about exploration. And I think there are some areas of cooperation. It's a matter of now, what are the Chinese going to do? What are they going to accept? And if the Chinese want to cross some of these unwritten red lines, they're my red lines, they're not the administration's red lines, then they're going to be taking more and more risk of direct engagement, military engagement with the United States. They don't want that. They want anything but that. So the Chinese are quickly trying to, they were inside the Philippine cabinet, essentially, of President Duterte. So after the July 12 meeting, President Duterte gets his new cabinet. He's been in power now only 2 weeks in Manila. And one of the cabinet ministers says, no, what the Chinese ambassador told me last night was this is what we have to do, A, B, and C. Basically, they were giving the private guidance to the new government. Here's what the Chinese expect for you to do. And then they reached out and said, as long as you reject the ruling and just put it aside, we'll talk to you because we're so loving in China. But anyway,
well, and that absolutely failed, right? I mean, the new prime minister was just not going to go for that deal.
The new president was...
Excuse me, you're right,
no,
president, sir.
President Duterte is a populist, perhaps, and he maybe was just the mayor of the third largest city, or the largest city in Mindanao, at least. But still, he knows a bad deal when he sees one, and that was not a good deal. So the Chinese are going to have to deal seriously with their neighbors, and that's really the point of this order building that we're trying to support. The United States can support something that can work because our goal is minimal. It's really achieving a higher degree of order and stability, freedom of navigation, more trade, more cooperation, more sort of risk reduction in terms of potential for conflict. The Chinese are growing the risk because they think they can essentially have a sphere of influence over this region. But this is not the 1900s or 1800s even. This is something in the 21st century where we're really going to have to cooperate in the region. And China knows it, but they don't want to live with that. So they're going to have to find a way to live with this. And as long as we don't provoke them and cause them severe excess losses of face, they may find ways to cooperate with elements of these sort of agreements and these understandings, these norms that will be built over time. This is a long-term process. This is not going to be over in 5 or 10 years even, but we have to work on it intelligently and be prepared to act if the Chinese do take brazen actions. We do have to be able to act appropriately.
I want to take you to one, very important international agreement part of this, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Does it undermine? Obviously, China is a signatory to it, so that sort of binds China to this decision, and the Philippines are a signatory, right? So, I mean, this is something that can no longer be sort of a unilateral action. But does it hurt the U.S. case that it is not? It has never ratified UNCLOS, despite efforts by senior military leaders and several American administrations to try to get that from the Senate?
It does undermine our case, and this is exactly the moment when the United States wants to maximize our credibility on behalf of the rule of law. So this is the time we really need to ratify it, and it also shows our weakness here, because we should be standing up and saying, look, UNCLOS is the international rule of law. But for us to say that, we have to speak out of one side of our mouth, and out of the other, we have to say, well, we haven't ratified it in our Senate. So it does undermine our case, but this is an argument that we have to, inside the United States. The fact is that China and the Philippines are both signatories to UNCLOS, and this was a ruling that pertained only to those two parties. So they are bound by it.
Patrick, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.